Good morning, everyone, and I'm so delighted to be with all of you today so that I can share our experiences in Illinois as we are reimagining our bail system and give you a little background on how all of this began. In about 2015, the Illinois Supreme Court started reviewing the practices in Cook County and looking at the operational review. And that led to the impetus for statewide review. So at the current time, I was also a member of the College of Education and served at faculty for many years. And I was asked to go throughout the state of Illinois and moderate forums with stakeholders just to find out what are those practices in Illinois, how can we address them. The Supreme Court had made an initiative to look at our practices and wanted to make sure that all 102 counties had a fair, transparent system in place. And so we started out with those tours throughout the state of Illinois. And unfortunately, what we found, I'm going to tell you, was kind of dismal and quite surprising to me as well as a sitting judge. For example, we learned that in 2% of the counties, the judge was not even present at the time the conditions of bond were set. We also learned that defense counsel was only present 49% of the time for first appearance. And we also learned that in some jurisdictions, 8% of the jurisdictions in the state of Illinois, the defendant wasn't even present at the bond setting, initial bond setting as well. So when we looked at this and brought back our information to the Supreme Court said, you know, we need to look at this and we need to do it better and we need to revamp or reimagine our bail system in the state of Illinois. So at that point in time, the Supreme Court convened in 2017 the Illinois Supreme Court Commission on Pretrial Practices, and I was honored and privileged to serve as the chair. Our charge was, again, to look at the system. And I want to make it clear, when we looked at the system, we just didn't look at, the result of what our new statute is. We looked at the system as a phenomenal change in the entire system from the time the defendant first interacts with police all the way through adjudication. It was very important to see that there was system change that needed to be made, not just certain aspects of what conditions were being set. We knew that there were defendants who should be deflected, shouldn't even be arrested at the time. Wasn't there a better place that we could handle individuals who are addicted to drugs, who have serious mental health behavioral issues? Is that something we could partner with other agencies to best serve that population? And it went all the way through adjudication as well. So we worked for over 2 years. Our commission had all branches of government as well as stakeholders. And we had some, as you can imagine, some quite interesting discussions over that 2 years and 2 months, because everybody comes to bail reform looking through a different lens, and we have to be respectful of that different lens. What may impact a police officer may have a different view than the judge sitting and hearing the case, and how people respond to individuals is different. So we really had to educate ourselves as well about what best practices, legal and evidence best practices. And we were so fortunate to partner with a National Institute of Corrections and have technical assistance throughout that 2 years and 2 months. Lori Eville, many of you may have known her, led us through some very difficult discussions, but we were able to meet our charge and we came up with our report. I lovingly refer to our report as a Russian novel. Many people looked at that and thought, this is a report, because it was quite lengthy. And it had 54 recommendations that needed to be done. And so I was asked to report before the Supreme Court, and I did. And they looked at the report, had reviewed and said, this is great. Now your work really begins, because now we're going to put you in charge of a task force. And now you have to implement all those recommendations or give us guidance on how we do that. So again, it's a multifaceted group, and we started looking at all of those and how do we do that? And because it was quite challenging, because many of them required legislative change, and the Supreme Court certainly can't tell the legislature what laws have to be passed. So we had legislators from leadership on our task force as well. And so we began very diligently going over our report and looking at their proposed Pretrial Fairness Act, which we knew that was in the works. And we started working very closely with that legislative subcommittee and explained to them what our 2 years and 2 months of research and collaboration, why we came up with our recommendations, and tried to work very closely with them. the legislature listened to us, and we were very happy to see that many of our recommendations came within that law, some not. And so we're still working on that. And what was frightening, though, is the bill passed and said it would be implemented in 6 months, and we knew there was no way that we would be prepared to be up and running in 6 months. So I appeared before Congress and asked that it give us at least 2 years so we could continue with our collaboration. One of the things with any bill, when you look at it, there might be unintended consequences, and in this bill there is. And we're concerned that some of the unintended consequences may even have the opposite effect of pretrial reform and may incarcerate individuals who would never have been incarcerated before. So we're really continuing to work with the legislature, talking about a trailer bill, trying to give some guidance as well as why we think there may have to be some tweaks. As you may know, Illinois is the first state to abolish cash as a condition of release. So it truly will be an in or out system. And we support our legislation and believe that it is a first step in modifying and changing pretrial practices in Illinois. We are mindful of the heavy lift to implement this as well. And our Supreme Court, again, made a very bold and courageous move because they determined the only way to do that in Illinois is to make a statewide pretrial service agency. And as you can imagine, we have a county-based pretrial at this time, or circuit-based. It's going to be quite a change to start an entire new department in our Administrative Office of Illinois Courts. So we are working at doing that now. And again, it is truly a heavy lift. We're doing it in phases. We were able to determine that there were 57 counties of the 102 who did not have a dedicated pretrial agency. And so we will be working with those counties in phase 1 and start setting up agencies with a goal line of having a majority of those with a start date of that January 23 date. But again, we could not have done our work without the support and the leadership and the guidance of the Supreme Court. They have really said, this is what we're going to do. We have to look at the system, and it's not what it could be. And due process and our constitutions demand that we do so. So that is how Illinois came to where we are today.
Thank you, Judge Stuckert. I appreciate that. And we'll loop back for some additional questions and additional follow-ups. Judge Harris, would you mind filling the audience in on the efforts that are taking place in Ramsey County and throughout the state of Minnesota?
First, I want to say welcome to everyone. Thank you for having me. I just want to start by giving just a legal framework regarding how we determine bail here in Minnesota. I see a number of folks who know this just as well as I do, but in Minnesota, particularly the Supreme Court passed a judicial rule which mandates each of our judicial districts to utilize a risk assessment tool. That risk assessment tool needs to be validated, and it needs to be an evidence-based risk assessment tool. So we all use what's called the MNPAT. I think there's only two districts, Hennepin County and then Cass County, that has opted out to use their own risk assessment tool. So ultimately, the way we are approaching this is that risk assessment tool will give us the information to make the determination as it relates to release or setting bail. Again, how the rules work is that there is a presumption for release unless the court finds that you're going to be a risk to public safety or you are going to not show up to court. Ultimately, this is us trying to make a science out of an art. And that's really what we're doing. We're trying to figure out who are going to show up to court, who's not going to show up to court, who's going to commit more offenses. Here in Ramsey County, we have been also working on the front end to figure out what are ways we can figure out who can and cannot be in custody before they even get to that bail decision by the judge. So we do have a bail reform work group, and we're working with the Arnold Foundation to determine ways to really think about how we can have people being released into the public, but also considering public safety and considering folks returning to court. So we've been working with our justice partners. So at the table is law enforcement, it is the judicial bench, the county attorney is active in this, as well as defense attorneys. And the idea is that if we have everyone at the table, we'll be able to make good decisions. And one of the key factors is also having community at the table, individuals who are justice involved, to get that perspective as well, so we can understand exactly kind of what are the best decisions to make in the framework. At this point, Minnesota is in a place where bail assessment tools are what we're using. That is kind of where we're at, and that's the space we're working in. Ultimately, we may move to a different space, but we are trying to figure out within that framework, what can we do to have better outcomes. So with that, I will leave some time for Ms. Korn from the Freedom Fund to add some information.
Thank you, Judge Harris. Jana, yeah, if you can talk a little bit about the Minnesota Freedom Fund's interactions with the reform efforts going on in Ramsey County and the state of Minnesota.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Once again, I'm Jana. I work at the Minnesota Freedom Fund. For those who are not aware of what we do, we are dedicated, we are an organization, a bail fund and a bond fund. We also pay immigration bonds besides bail to ensure that people can be released from custody. And we also have a long-term vision to end pretrial detention or cash bail in the state of Minnesota and the harmful practices of immigrant detention. The Minnesota Freedom Fund serves on the bail reform working group that Judge Harris mentioned, and has spent the past 2 years kind of serving as one of those community voices at the table in Ramsey County. And we are really sitting there because we want to find a way to reduce the harms that cash bail has created within Ramsey County in the state of Minnesota. Currently, Ramsey County is the only really active bail reform efforts that we have going on in this state. There are not any other similar kind of county working level groups, and we hope to soon see not only working groups in other counties, but also really a statewide effort, because we know that there are people harmed across the state. We don't want it to be just, positive impacts on people in the county, but we would like to have massive changes and an end to pretrial detention statewide.
Excellent. Thanks, Jana. So I'm going to throw this out to the panelists. We've talked about eliminating cash bail as being sort of an integral piece in pretrial reform. What do you think the major, and I'm just going to throw it out there because this is sort of the sacred cow on this conversation, what are the major barriers to eliminating cash bail? I talk around the country and I meet with stakeholders around, whether it's in rural or urban areas, Republican-leaning states, Democratic-leaning states. At the end of the day, most of the stakeholders agree that cash bail is something that needs to be removed. However, it seems to not be moving as quickly as I think many of us would like to. So honestly, what are some of the barriers that we are experiencing? What barriers are you experiencing, and how do we sort of mobilize opportunities like this where we're talking about fundamentally reforming our system to mobilize individuals around this centralized issue? And I'll open it up to whoever has thoughts or comments.
Sure. We are in the process of going through what we're calling listening tours. And we go, our new agency and myself, and we go to each of the circuits and we just ask, what are the barriers? What are the concerns you have? And we do a Mentee Poll. I don't know if you've ever used that, where you say to individuals, what are you thinking about? What are your thoughts on pretrial? And you can call in on your cell phone and type in 3 or 4 words to tell what people are thinking of. And the more that someone types in a phrase, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger on the screen. And I will tell you, the biggest one so far is community safety. There is a fear that if you abolish cash as a condition of release, and I say cash as a condition of release because Cash was never meant to detain people impermissibly. It was a condition to be released, but we sure have skewed that and thought of it differently over the years. It has become a detention mechanism. And so that's the first thing we hear, it's going to be less safe. And that's a critical part of any reform is we do know that there are individuals who have a greater risk of community safety to individuals that should be detained during their cases. We understand that and know that they're a very small portion, and our Supreme Court has told us liberty should be the norm, and it should be just a small percentage who would be detained pretrial since they are presumed to be innocent of their charges. But we do know that. And what we need to really look at is what types of charges or what types of individuals do we think should be detained? And unfortunately, everything in pretrial has been based on a charge. So if you say that someone's got a scary charge, somehow that makes them more scary to individuals, even though we know that the vast majority of people released on pretrial are successful on pretrial and do not commit further violent criminal offenses, and they do appear in court if we help them with some of the barriers or challenges that defendants have of actually coming to court when required as well. So community safety, it is just going to people, letting people discuss and tell them it doesn't. And that's where data has to be the most important thing that anybody does in pretrial. Because what you do is if you collect good data and you can go back to people and say to them, you may perceive that, you may anecdotally believe that, because there will always be that disastrous case where someone is released on pretrial and commits a horrific offense. But that happens every day in the criminal justice system when people plead guilty and are released on charges and receive a supervisory sentence and may commit a horrific offense too. But that is just the inherent nature of criminal justice. And so we have to accept that. But if you can collect data and show people that this will not impact community safety in the way that they believe it will, that most people are successful on pretrial release. And the only way that you do that is really to collect data and educate people. So with our listening tours, that's the first thing we hear, community safety. Another impact that we have in the state of Illinois that other people don't have is we do not have bail bondsmen. However, 10% of all bonds that are posted go to county government to run county government. And so impermissibly, yes, that's not what bond was meant for, but we have had a great concern on small communities that if you take away that 10% that we were able to keep, how are we going to sustain our programs? And many arguments that we're hearing are, we have a great drug court, but if you take away that 10% that also helps our drug court, we're not going to be able to give community services to individuals that we have before. These are really issues that do exist throughout the state of Illinois. And so we have a lot of challenges on education and communication as to community safety. It is not going to be impacted in a negative way that you believe. And that's a tough sell for a lot of people.
Thank you, Judge Stockert. Judge Harris, I saw you unmute yourself, so any comments, thoughts, ideas?
Well, I think I was going to say something similar to Judge Stockert. I think we cannot undersell the concern regarding public safety as it relates to this issue of pretrial release. That is typically the biggest concern that folks have. And quite frankly, the thing about pretrial release is oftentimes if someone is successful on pretrial release, you're not going to hear about it. They're going to come to court, they're going to do what they're supposed to do, and they're going to move on with their life. When they're unsuccessful in pretrial release, those are the cases we hear about, and those are typically the serious ones that catch headlines. So the question is not just data, it's messaging. For example, in New York, in 2019, that bill to reform their pretrial release was not only because they got the data, but they had the story. Khalif Browder sitting in jail, charged for years, gets killed. So folks saw the effect of pretrial release on an individual who ultimately was not guilty of what they were supposed to. And folks can understand that message and say, okay, this individual should not have been sitting in jail for that long to await trial. These are the types of messages we need to consider in thinking about pretrial release. I think as you know, you look around the country, there's generally three ways you're going to get to reform. It's either going to be through the courts telling you to do it. It's going to be through the people finally having, you know, the ballot to do it, or it's going to be through legislative process. And with any one of those, you can't just have individuals who are like-minded. Unfortunately, you got to sit down with folks who have concerns as well, because those are going to be the individuals who are going to hold up any progress. And oftentimes in these spaces, we don't do that. We sit down with like-minded individuals and we all talk about how we need to change it. But unfortunately, when you move it forward, you can't do it without thinking about the other perspective. So I say you think about public safety and really consider it. We have to think about what do we do and how do we assess individuals who do pose a threat to the public, and how do we address that. And then also we tell the stories of those who have been successful, because I think it's important for folks to understand that the vast majority of individuals who come through the courts who are released on pretrial release, they show up to court and they are successful. And we need to reinforce that message.
Well said. Thank you so much, Judge Harris. Jana,
Yeah.
comments, thoughts?
I definitely agree with the two judges that I think public safety is one of the hugest barriers. And I think the other one, which I think relates to public safety, is political will, right? As Judge Harris outlined, there's a couple different paths that we can move forward in Minnesota, right? Whether that be the legislative branch, judicial branch, and both of those, I think, have to have the community and the people behind it, right? So it's not just having conversations with people about what does this new system look like, or what does the new thing look like when people are released, but it's also convincing and talking and having those same conversations with the people who can actually have the power to make the change, and making sure that they are understand the same things that you were talking about, Judge Stuckert, in Illinois, right? That there are ways to do this, and there is a better way to do it. And frankly, our system is not working right now. Our system is not working. Our prison system is not working. Our bail system is not working. Our policing system is not working. And none of that is working, right? Yesterday, one of the speakers said very eloquently, if all of these systems work, we'd be one of the safest places in the world, because of the amount of money that we spend on incarceration and on policing and keeping people behind bars. And none of those, they're not working. And so I think having those conversations, not only with people in the community, but with people in power, to really have that political will, because right now it does not exist in Minnesota. Right now, we are not at the place where you were talking about in Illinois, where we have a mandate from the Supreme Court saying, let's look at this issue because it's important to the Minnesota Supreme Court. Right now, at the Minnesota legislature, we don't have a bill that is super comprehensive that we are rallying behind. Instead, we have a bill that was passed at the Minnesota Senate last year that it was trying to prevent Minnesota Freedom Fund from even operating and posting bail for individuals. So we have work to do. That is clear around community education, around engagement, around talking with people and explaining that, and really bringing them along and showing what this vision is and how it can be better for all of us.
Right. Yeah. Great points. Thank you, panelists. I think one of the things that I want to get back to, and I think this is something that, frankly, I think the criminal justice or criminal legal system is not very good at, is sharing data, collecting data, and then obviously communicating and messaging and educating not only other stakeholders, but also the community as a whole. I'm just wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about strategies that you've seen work, strategies that you'd be willing to explore, strategies that you think that would be effective communicating this message, again, to a broad range of potential audiences, including, like I said, other stakeholders. But I think the biggest piece that we often ignore is the community as a whole. We tend to mystify our process, and specifically around the pretrial decision-making process, it's not a well-known or well-understood decision point. So thoughts from the panelists, and again, I'm open to anyone taking that. You
mentioned something, Nick, about data, which I think is a piece of how you can do you can start conversations around community engagement. It's not the only piece. You do need stories, and you need people who are justice involved, you know, to be at the table and to be talking and have their voices there. But we don't have data about the state of bail in Minnesota. There is no, right now, despite the best efforts of multiple organizations, not just Minnesota Freedom Fund, but other organizations, we don't know what the average bail amount is in the state of Minnesota. We do not have data on racial disparities. We know they exist. We know that they are baked into our system. We don't know if you have drastically different bail amounts set in one county to another county. The Minnesota Freedom Fund has made requests along with other organizations to some counties to try to get this data, and we have not been able to access it. And that is a problem, because if you want to have, as Judge Stuckert said in Illinois, they know they needed data to help craft the solution, right? And so for us to even adequately explain everything in the state of bail in Minnesota and how it's being harmful, we don't know that. We know some preliminary data, which is, this is pre-COVID numbers. On any given night, on any given day, there's 6,000 people sitting in Minnesota jails across the state. And we know the majority of them are pretrial, right? And we know that that most of them, right, are sitting there because they cannot afford bail. That's why they're sitting there pretrial, is because they cannot afford to post it. But aside from that, we don't have a lot of, we can't even start to have those conversations in a real robust way, because we are lacking that, and the state is not transparent with releasing their data.
And I would agree with that too, because, you know, one of the first things when you talk about the elimination of cash bond, and I'm sure all of you have heard this, if there's no longer any skin in the game, people aren't going to come to court, or people will commit a further offense. And so I started looking at data in Illinois, and I said, do we keep data of how many people who post cash as a condition of release fail to appear or recidivate? And nobody kept that record at all. That has never been data that's collected. So when you're trying to tell people that this system of in or out is correct and will enhance community safety and will have a huge impact on people's lives, allowing them to get back to work, get their kids to school, do all that, that's why they await trial. If you try to discuss that, and then there's nothing to correlate it to, so people still in their mind go, cash means something. And it certainly does not. And I will tell you, there was one defendant in my courtroom who committed a further offense that said, oh, I posted $1,000. I better not do this deed, or I'm going to lose that $1,000. That just does not go through the thought process of the individuals at the time they may be involved in criminal activity. Just as failure to appear. If I have to make a decision and someone has posted my bond, or I've posted my bond, but my boss said, if you miss any more court dates, you are fired, I'm going to give up that money in a heartbeat to continue to work to support my family. So even though we can say cash means something, we didn't have any data to refute it one way or the other. And that's when we started looking at Illinois and go, we're not even collecting the appropriate data. If we want to change our system, people want to know, if we're going to change something, tell me why we have to change and tell me the benefit of that change. And if you don't have data collected or are working with data, and again, it's just a component, as both Judge Harris and Jana have said, but it's a very important component, because then you can tell people, let me look at this, let me show you this. But that's half of the problem, Jana, is there's not a really consistent manner of collecting data. And another problem, if you don't collect data correctly, I am a proponent of risk assessments only as a tool to assist a judge in making a decision. A risk assessment should never dictate what a judge should do. It's a tool to assist. But if the tool is based, as all risk assessment tools are, prior convictions, and if we're not even collecting the data in the same way as what is a prior conviction, then those risk assessments, many people, you know, you look at it and go, how is that really assisting us? So we have a data collection as part of our new comprehensive bill that's required, and we're in the process of making huge changes regarding data collection in Illinois.
Thank you. Well, and I think just to piggyback on something that both Jana and Judge Stuckert have talked about, is that I'm on the state of Illinois' data oversight committee. And one of the first things that became very, very apparent in the first meeting was that we're not comparing apples to apples from county to county. We're looking at jail systems data, and every county, every jurisdiction is using a different data management system, which may classify data in a different way. It makes the ability for us to tell our story very difficult, but at the same time, it's an opportunity for us to get to understand those systems and hopefully draw some outcome data out of those systems so that we can add data to our anecdotal stories and the stories of impacted individuals. I think it's definitely something that is a challenge. It's not just a challenge in the pretrial decision point, it's a challenge across the criminal justice system, but it is definitely something that we have to work for. And given the fact that I am a non-voting member on the Minnesota Justice Research Center board, this gives me an opportunity to sort of pressure them to continue to work in that area as well. So we do have a question from the audience that I think is relevant, especially when we're talking about conditions of release. Thoughts about balancing public safety versus over conditioning or over supervising is, I think, another really important topic when we're talking about pretrial reform. Obviously, there's many jurisdictions that use drug testing and electronic monitoring, in my opinion, more so than they probably should, along with office contacts and some sort of supervision contacts. So I'm just wondering if I could get the panelists' thoughts and ideas on how do we balance that, not only on a case-by-case basis, but then how do we also, again, since this has been sort of an underlying theme, how do we communicate this with stakeholders and the community as a whole?
Yeah, I'll be glad to address that because that's a real concern we have. In Illinois, the Preventive Detention Statute, in order to detain someone, it has to be a forcible felony, which is defined by statute, and a non-probational offense. All of the drug trafficking cases are not, as of January 23, will not be detainable. So they cannot have a detention hearing. It can't go before the court to just consider whether those individuals will be detained. As you may imagine, law enforcement has trouble with that aspect of the bill, as do judges. And our fear is because many people are defining the eligibility not to detain has been too narrowly drawn in the state of Illinois. The result is going to be individuals released, all of them, on electronic monitoring because there will be no other way to detain those individuals. So our biggest concern is we may see a huge increase in electronic monitoring throughout the state of Illinois. And as we all know, depending on who monitors EM can be just as restrictive to an individual as being incarcerated behind bars. You're behind bars in your home, and you're not being able to do all of those things that are so important for individuals whose liberty is taken away from them. We have discussed this with the legislature as well, and we are concerned that there's going to be a pendulum swinging in a opposite of legal and evidence-based practices. At the current time, there are already in Cook County in Chicago close to 3,000 people on any given day on electronic home monitoring. And it's run by their sheriff's department, but the chief judges also have an EM program. And we're looking at that very closely now with the task force and that. So our concern is we're also going to see over supervision. So individuals who could be released without even being placed on pretrial, if a judge feels that that person should have been able to be detained, they're going to go on pretrial, they're going to go on drug testing, they're going to go on EM, and they're going to be over conditioned. And that is a huge concern. And the only way that we are going to be able to address that is to set up standards. We're looking at standards to be required for EM, who can be on EM. The statute does require a 60-day review on EM, but quite frankly, 60 days can be a long time to be on electronic monitoring. And the consequences that can impact individuals as well. And one thing if pretrial has taught me anything, it is these are individual people standing in front of you that you're making conditions. There should be no cookie cutter conditions as well. But I'm afraid because there's a perception that the detention net has been so narrowly drawn that we're going to see cookie cutter orders and everybody released is going to be going through, let me check this box, let me check this box, let me check this box. So we're very concerned about the unintended consequences of overconditioning as well. But I think our way of dealing with this is education, 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 and going through the communities and those 57 counties that we will be working with that don't have an existing pretrial agency to have continuing communication and education regarding legal and evidence-based practices. But I do see an uptick in conditioning.
Thank you, Judge Tucker. Judge Harris?
And I agree. I think at the end of the day, if you're going to move from one system to the other, the question is always going to be, how are we going to protect public safety and ensure individuals return? And I think how our system has developed, bail has been that crutch. You set bail, and the idea is if they don't show up, they forfeit the bail, they have skin in the game. I agree with Judge Stucker. That's probably not what is going through folks' minds when these things are happening. But as judges, you're considering, you're thinking about, this individual with this type of offense and these things, like what's going to happen if I just let them leave without any conditions? Those conditions are going to replace that bail as the crutch. So if I release them, if I put them on electronic home monitoring, if I do, check-ins, things like that, is that going to mitigate if anything occurs? Also, I think sometimes there is just a marrying of kind of this idea of trying to assist the individual. So yeah, I know it's pretrial, but if we give him drug testing and get him set up, maybe that will help him down the line. So I think there is that paternalistic kind of thought to it. There was one question in the chat regarding failure to appears and that data. I think with the data, that's another concern. At the end of the day, we need to know how many folks are failing to appear and the reason why, because ultimately they fail to appear, they're issued a warrant, and now they have been moved from one kind of system where there's issues to another one, where now we're in this never-ending warrant process where we bring them in, then we have to determine whether or not to release them or not, and then again, we're in that issue. So really determining all facets of the issue, that being not only the detriment to the individual being detained, but also, who is failing to appear? Why are they doing that? What are the resources that we can provide to limit that as well? Because I think that's also very important in this idea of pretrial release. We need, again, have everyone at the table, have all the information at the table. I think it's funny we're talking about data because in 1993, Minnesota released the Racial Bias Task Force report. It was a comprehensive report on bias in the courts. And in 1993, one of the issues they talked about was data, getting data to assess bail and how we do that. And it's funny that we're now in 2021 still talking about data.
Yeah.
We're over 2 decades plus out from the report and we're still talking about data. So again, these are things that we've been talking about, and it's really going back to what Jana said. It's about the political will, about actually getting it done, because we know what the issue is. We just need to address it.
Thank you, Judge Harris. That's a great point. I think I often talk about, and I quote RFK's speech to the Senate on bail back from 1968, where it says there's two systems, one criminal justice system for those with money and one for those that don't. Again, same sort of concept. We're talking about the same issues 50, 60 years later. It makes me very concerned, and that's part of the reason why this topic is so important for us to continue to talk about, is because we do need to generate that political will to fundamentally change our system. So one of the other questions that I think I would be remiss from not talking about, but I think it's relevant given the fact that we're dealing with the COVID pandemic and obviously rules and practice changes within the courts. What have we learned with regards to virtual court appearances and failure to appear, and how that links up with or potentially links up with how we make bail decisions in the future. Because again, anecdotally, from my perspective, is my hope is if we make it easier for people to appear in court, we're going to have less failures to appear, which means that in theory we should be less worried about failure to appear as a risk for releasing individuals in the first place. But I'm just curious if those things have been talked about as being instituted whenever we get through the pandemic and get back to whatever normal looks like. So Judge Harris, I'm interested in your thoughts and comments about that.
The short answer is yes, those things are being considered. You know, there is a group looking at what hearings would be appropriate for virtual hearings versus in person. That's going to always be that kind of never-ending debate between kind of constitutional rights and protections and being more convenient. I think anecdotally, in some of these first appearance hearings, more people are appearing and folks are showing up. However, now we're addressing the issue of informalities within the courtroom, because when it's a Zoom court, it's very different than being in person. I think folks have a greater understanding of the weight of the procedure in person. My personal opinion is that if folks show up, that's good. Let's just get you here. Let's move things forward. Let's get you heard. That's not always the opinion of every judicial officer. There are some who are very invested in the formality and the gravitas of courts. And that's one of the things we're looking at. Also, courts as systems, any large system, it's always very difficult to move them from where they're at and the way they've done it to new things. It's like turning a cruise ship around on a dime. It's just sometimes doesn't happen. It takes time. They got to go down the ocean, take a gentle turn, and then eventually it happens. Unfortunately, COVID, you know, put that iceberg right ahead and said, okay, you need to turn or you're going to crash and burn. So now that we've turned, getting the mindset of folks into saying, you know what, there is a convenience factor that will help us, but also there are some hearings that we just need to have in person. And I think we're going to figure that out, and really moving forward with input will be the way we do that.
Thank you, Judge Harris. And then I have one other question, and again, I'm sorry, there's a lot of chat questions coming in quickly, and I'm trying to do my best to stay on top of them. One of the things that I think is a relevant issue to chat about, because it's something that I've heard judges and commissioners and magistrates talk about, is the public pressure or the media pressure to make decisions, and the fear about having, and we've talked about this a little bit earlier, sort of that front page headline story. How can we compete against that? How can we deal with those issues? Again, they're very real issues to some, especially considering some judges, many judges are elected officials. How do we deal with that when we're talking about bail reform and making significant public policy changes?
I think putting public safety front and center on the discussion and how are we going to address that. I think judges are humans like anyone else, and you are thinking about those issues. I do want to take a step back to say at least the judges, many of the judges I know who I respect, this bail decision it's a very critical decision, and they take it very seriously. And the ones who do it really well, they do think about, you know, the individuals and how it's going to affect their lives. But there are some who don't, and even if they do, this idea of public safety is going to trump any concern. At the end of the day, unfortunately, because as I said earlier, it's an art, not a science. You can never know directly who's going to be that individual who goes out and commits that heinous crime. And sometimes, you know, and if an individual wants to do that, they're going to do that. And even if you set bail, quite frankly, they can bail out and go still do that. So really the question then becomes, are we just going to hold them or not hold them? And I don't think we're at that point, but I think really as you start the discussion, make public safety part of the discussion and make it a critical part of the discussion, because you're going to have to get a wide a variety of people on board to say this system's going to also protect public safety as well.
Excellent. Jana, Judge Stuckert, any comments about that?
And I would concur. And one of the things, I had a discussion with one of our listening tours. One of the judges said this specific thing, Judge Harris, that you just said. You know, in Illinois, judges are appointed. An associate judge is appointed by elected circuit judges, but there is an election process and a retention process that goes before the public. Once you are elected as a circuit judge, you run for retention every 6 years and have to get 60% of the vote to be retained. So it would be a disservice not to think that some people who are always running for election, and depends on what state you're in, that that's not a component of their decision making. It is just the nature of the beast, and we have to understand that. But when I had the judge talking to me about this concern that he would rather err in the side of safety by incarcerating that individual and keeping them detained instead of releasing them. And so I just said, Judge, what do you do most every day in a felony courtroom? What's the majority of your work? And the majority of my work, 96%, if you look at the national statistics, was accepting plea agreements. And at the time I accepted that plea agreement, what did I know about the defendant before me? Did I know much about their risk, how risky they would be? No, I had two sworn officers of the court who had reached an agreement. I listened to the factual basis to see if it supported it. I listened to criminal history. And that was about it. And then I accepted, majority of time that plea. And I no more knew the risk of that individual. But what I did know about that individual at the time I accepted the plea, as opposed to the person on pretrial, was that person was guilty. I don't know that at pretrial. There is the presumption of innocence, and we have to understand that. That is the presumption of innocence. And so why am I willing to take the risk at the end and accept a plea 96% of the time when I know that person is guilty, but I will not accept that risk at pretrial when I know that person is presumed innocent of the charges? And it just clearly is a mindset issue of just trying to say, why will you do that at the end of the case, but not do it at the beginning of the case? And when you have those discussions and start talking to judges about that, they go, I don't know, so it's like Judge Harris said, you have to put community safety as the number one thing. As a judge for 20 years, I could have cared less about a headline that said Judge Stuckert released John Smith today and he didn't come back to court for his next court appearance. I was concerned about the headline that said Judge Stuckert released John Smith today and he committed a heinous offense and killed his wife. So we do understand that, and that has to go in the equation when we are looking at human beings, and judges are human beings that make decisions. But we have to, as you said, Judge Harris, community safety has to be in the forefront. We have to understand, we have to meet people where they are at and involving pretrial and working in that way. But it is something that is, it can't be just, it has to be addressed about the perceptions and what judges deal with every day when they're making these liberty decisions.
Nick, can I add one thing?
Absolutely. I was just going to cue you up. Yep.
Great. I was just going to say we have a lot of conversations about community safety, and I just don't want to end this panel before saying we are really remiss if we're not also talking about the safety of the individuals who were accused of the crime. And I think that's incredibly important to talk about. As Judge Stuckert said, right, all the folks there are presumed innocent, and their safety and their well-being should be as critical as anyone else's, because as you've heard, as we know, the vast majority of people do show up to court. They do everything they're supposed to do. And the harm that is caused to them every single day that they are held in jail is immeasurable. Most of us know the term collateral consequences, and there are a lot from sitting in jail pretrial. You are more likely to have a negative outcome in your case. You are going to, have chances to lose your job, have your children taken away, strain, the relationships be taken out of your community. And that's not even to mention the fact that we do know there are problems with actual safety, physical safety of people who are held in detention, right? It's not, we have, 86 county jails and across the state that probably have varying degrees of safety for people who are held there. And so I just don't want us to we have to make sure that conversations about safety also include the people who are being accused of the crime and the individuals that we are bailing out that deserve as much access to live a healthy and full life as anyone else.
Well said, Jana. And I was actually going to bring up the 3 Days Matter research article that came out of Arnold Ventures a handful of years ago, focusing on the negative ramifications of just as little as 72 hours of incarceration. It is immense. It is significant. It's part of the reason why both Judge Harris and Judge Stuckert have said that pretrial decision-making decision is so important, and judges who do it really well take the time to consider all the potential consequences, and I agree 100%. So one of the questions that I think we may have touched on earlier, but I just want to make sure it gets addressed in this conversation. It's, again, related to the communication. We talking about the data and trying to get the data specifically to the media sources, right? And getting the media to care about reporting on as Judge Harris mentioned this earlier, the thousands of cases that get released and nothing happens. There's no negative consequences. They show up to all their court appearances. How do we get the media outlets to care about those stories and about the overall data of the overwhelming success of pretrial defendants who are released? Any thoughts, ideas, comments? Jana, I'm sort of hoping that's something that you've got an idea on, because I sort of think that, again, the Minnesota Freedom Fund is sort of positioned uniquely to take on some of those conversations.
I do think that sometimes it is telling, stories. I think that we have clients, we have, over 1,000 clients, that we have, or people that we have helped out in the last year by posting their bail. And, many of them have success stories. And I think a huge part of it is telling their story. I think that we have a delicate balance, because for a lot of folks, that's allowing people the access and the ability to tell their story for many people can be a positive thing. And for others, it can lead to more trauma. We don't want this to be a condition of us, working with them. So I feel like stories are a key component of it, but I don't want us to rely so heavily on assuming that is the best and the only route, for all of it. I think that it is being consistent with how we talk and how we address, and being really proactive with how we approach the media. And I think that needs to happen, not just from organizations like Freedom Fund, like we need to do this, but other folks as well. And we need to kind of have consistent language with all the people who are on the same side, that we need to kind of end this detention, that we are sending regular messages and pushing back against a lot of false narratives that are continually perpetuated in the media. Or when not even just by the media, but frankly by who they choose to give voice to, right? Because sometimes it's not even an individual reporter, but they're continuing to give voice to people who are fear mongering and who are kind of saying the negative side, and they're not giving equal access or even time and space to people who are kind of portraying another message. And so I think it will need to be a concerted effort, not just on our part, but upon anyone who's working with us on bail.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jana. And I appreciate it. Our time is at a close. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this wonderful discussion, and especially thank the panelists. It has been a pleasure moderating, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I look forward to seeing most of you in other sessions. Thank you again. I appreciate it.